This unit on natural language processing seems like as good a time as any to talk about incorporating large language models into workflows. Now, this is something that a lot of you have been talking about in the discussion forums, but I wanted to take a look at how this happens technically and maybe show you some of the tools that help you with the representation of the process and with the actual execution of the process. So this discussion comes from a paper that I read recently on this very thing on large language models and automatic workflow generation. So this is a paper in the ACM Digital Library. ACM is the Association for Computing Machinery. They have often, fairly technical articles about, issues having to do with management. So I read in there quite a bit. This is from 2023, and it talks about using a special purpose large language model to generate a workflow. Now, the capabilities of large language models have gotten much more advanced in just the last couple of years. So we don't even need a special purpose large language model now to do this very thing. And I'm going to show you how this works. So let's say, every business, regardless of the size, has business processes. So here are some examples of just business processes. Depending on the size of the organization, they'll have more or less level of you know, uh, formality and documentation. But there are processes everywhere. So things like invoice processing, employee onboarding, customer support ticket routing, sales lead qualification, some kind of compliance reporting, marketing campaign approval, or an IT access request. So these are processes. And whether, if you may not even have them very formalized, they're just things that you do. And nowadays there are these tools, these so-called process mining tools that will go through your logs and say, wait, you actually do have a process here, and I'm going to go ahead and document it for you based on the events of what you've actually done. So let's take a look. Let's just take an example, and we'll do it very generically and say we would like to describe and formalize our process of how we process invoices. Of course, there are multiple steps on this where you have to receive the invoice, and that's kind of the inciting event or the trigger event. And, you have to, check to make sure that this actually represents something that was approved. So you have to access the purchase order, make sure that it was authorized, and then you have to set up the payment. So let's just take a look at this and say, well, can an LLM give us a pretty good workflow? Now, a workflow is just a formal representation of a process. Okay, so let's go to I'm very fond of GPT, but for this particular task, I found that Claude works pretty well. So I'm just going to say generate a workflow for invoice processing. Now, notice I didn't say what the invoices were or what steps I want, but let's just start off in the most generic way possible and see what it comes up with. Okay, so all right, so it's giving me a text description of all of the steps, and this looks pretty good. This hits more than what I mentioned in the introduction. So it talks about, okay, so there's the receipt. Okay, so you receive it in a number of different possible ways. You have to use optical character recognition to pull the data off of it if it's a paper thing, or like a PDF that doesn't have raw text in it. So then you have to verify that it's complete and legible. Okay, step three is registration and coding. So if you have some kind of accounting system that you have to enter it into, so matching it with the purchase order and with a receipt to confirm that whatever it is you're paying for, you've actually received those goods. And then this approval workflow. Okay, so Claude has laid out the steps of the process. So we have a workflow here. Okay, record keeping and reconciliation, reporting and analytics. So this is probably more elaborate than most people need, but let's just say we're going to go with this. Um, I can now say, okay, I like this process, but I want to have a representation of it that's a little bit easier to read, kind of a flow chart. So we use so we're at this step here. So we've generated the steps of the workflow using the large language model. Now we want to represent it using a syntax which is called business process modeling notation. So this is something that we teach to the undergraduates as a way of just visualizing a process so that it makes a lot of sense. And you've probably seen, slightly different versions of this. The one that I like is what's called the swim lane diagram, where each of these rows here is an agent, so some kind of functioning entity that's involved in the process. And these activities are on these rectangles, and the flows are actually these arrows. So you see that so the customer buys the product, and then this kind of wavy thing is some kind of document. Okay, so this is a nice way of visualizing the whole process. So you make sure you hit all the steps. So we can have this Claude large language model. Can you generate a business process modeling diagram of this workflow? Okay. Now the way Claude is set up is that when it creates artifacts, it does it over here on the right. Okay, so it has created this kind of free text version of the. Okay, and now it used that code to create the actual diagram. So right over here, we have the diagram itself. Okay, so we see that, so the initial event is the trigger, so invoice received, and then so this particular kind of process notation is just kind of a flow chart where the diamonds represent some choice. So the invoice is received, and then you have to determine the invoice type, and then based on that type, you do certain things. Now, okay, so there are all these different decisions and activities and documents that have to be done. So if you find the purchase order, yes, then you have to make sure that it matches. So in looking at a workflow like this, you can start to see, okay, anything that involves some kind of document processing. So receiving an email and checking for something, or writing an email, or taking a document and summarizing it. So now we see these opportunities to have pieces of this workflow executed by the large language model. Now, so this is starting to get into what's called robotic process automation. That's kind of a strange term, because we often think of robots as something physical. But in RPA, the robots are really, so if you think about a robot in a factory, it's walking around and it's moving things and it's polishing things and it's picking things up. Instead of those activities, you can think of robotic process automation as actually something virtual sitting at your machine doing the kinds of clicking and typing and sending and reading activities that you do. So let's say you receive an email. Based on that, you query a database, you copy something out of that, put it into a spreadsheet, save the spreadsheet, and then send it to somebody. A robotic process automation would do all those steps for you. You just have to set it up. And then all of those steps will be done. They call it a robot. It's not really a robot. It's really more like software scripting, but that's kind of the term that kind of won out in the marketing space. So what we want to do then is to take this representation of the process and then have it executable. And the way we can do that now is to, once again, we use Claude. We can say, please convert this process into BPMN XML. So this is a tag-based representation of the process that we can actually bring into an execution platform for this process. Okay. And so you wind up with something like this. So you don't necessarily have to know everything about how XML works, but you have these tags, and we have these the name of the tag kind of describes what it is, and then it has certain attributes. But notice that we have this tag here that is the start, and the identifier, the name of the start process is the invoice received. And what this is a declaration of the steps of the process and then what has to be done. So notice that, okay, so let's see if we can read some of this. So there's the start event. It's got something outgoing, flow to invoice type. So I guess what we're supposed to do is find, the invoice type. Let me see. I think down here at the bottom, it's got all the flow identifications and then what order they're supposed to go in. Yeah, so sequence flow. So to invoice type, and then it's got these. Okay, so inputs, outputs. So basically all the inputs, outputs, and then the flows, everything that was in that flow chart is now in this XML document. Now, this XML document can then be loaded into something like Commanda, which is, they call it, an agentic orchestrator. So really what this is a workflow execution tool where you can take this XML document, load it into here, and then the parser that's in this goes through that document and then executes certain software functions based on what's in that XML document. And one of the things that you can add into this is what's called an LLM connector. So if we say in our, let's see if I can go back to that physical representation. There's the document. I want the diagram. Okay. So if you were looking at your process here and you see that you have to check whether the data is complete and valid. You could, in that agentic workflow execution platform, you could add what's called an LLM connector here, where you could say, okay, send the invoice to this large language model, prompt the large language model in this way, take the output of the large language model, and if that output contains this, then do this. So on these individual steps of the workflow, you can actually automatically hook in connectors to the large language models. Okay. Um, so, okay. Okay. So, as we're thinking about, you know, any kind of any kind of workflow that involves document processing. So you receive an invoice, that's a document. You have to send an email. You have to check. You have to check for similarities between two things. You have to access the ERP or the procurement system to find that purchase order and then make sure that document matches certain features of this document. All of these functions, all of these so-called document processing functions can be done with an LLM. So you can have your whole workflow automated and have the LLM just kind of chime in where it needs to do any kind of document processing. So I think this is how, obviously not everybody is going to be using this. There's a um, well, depending on the size of the business and the maturity of the processes and the formality of the processes, you may need something like this or you may not. But I do think that this is going to be a great way that LLMs in particular and NLP in general are going to really add a lot of value to businesses.